Easily one of the most recognizable Spectrum platformers is Dynamite Dan, and it's also one that I spent a lot of time on as a kid. The basic gameplay style doesn't differ much from most Manic Miner and Jet Set Willy clones, but the ultimate goal is a bit different. You need to collect 8 sticks of dynamite from around the huge map, and blow up the safe somewhere in the middle, and free your girlfriend from the clutches of Dr. Blitzen. I would assume Jet Set Willy is at least somewhat more known for modern gamers than Dynamite Dan, but the gameplay style is very much the same. You walk and jump around the huge maze-like map, collecting items and avoiding getting hit by enemies that do nothing more dangerous than go back and forth their predefined path. The problem is, there are hundreds of enemies around the map, and you have no weapons to deal with them. You can only attempt to jump or walk past them and hope you don't get hit. You have 9 lives at the beginning of the game, and soon enough you will realize that it's not nearly enough to make it anywhere near to the end. At least you will be able to pick up extra lives and shield items that will help you kill the enemies without getting killed yourself. Nevertheless, it's a huge ordeal to get through, which I've never done myself. Nevertheless, I did write a comparison of it for my comparison blog in December 2013, so if you want to read more about Dynamite Dan and all its versions, click on the link in the description. Next up, Commando. Yeah, Commando. As much as I love Rob Hubbard's epic music in the C64 version, the Spectrum version was the first version that I played, and from the 2 most obvious competitors, it remains the one I always get more nostalgic about. It helps a lot that the Spectrum version of Commando not only has a proper loading screen, but also all the levels from the arcade original. Sure, we now have the fairly recent superior reworking called Commando Arcade on the C64, but in that case, there's no nostalgia factor, apart from the name of the group who made it. Anyway, if for some odd reason you're not familiar with Commando, it's only one of the most classic top-down push-scrolling lonesome hero kind of a shooter in the vein of Rambo and such. The only speciality our hero has is the possibility to throw hand grenades that you can pick up along the way, and the only real goal is to get through all 8 levels. Originally developed and released to the arcades by Capcom in 1985, it was the game that redefined the genre established by Taito's Front Line in 1982. Again, this is a game I decided to write a comparison of in the early days of my comparison blog, so that's another link to follow below in the video description if you feel like reading some more. One of the games that got my brother playing on the Spectrum on a more regular basis was a curious hockey-like game called Xeno. This is a game that's as difficult to describe as it is to master, but I'll try to be brief. Shortly put, it's like Hat Trick meets Ball Blazer from a different angle, but not quite. The long version of it is that you're playing a game of air hockey of sorts on a hexagonal ice rink. And as in air hockey, there is only one paddle for each player to control. The method of playing is rather tricky though. You take turns with the opposite player, and during your turn of a limited time, you need to aim for your paddle to hit a certain direction at a chosen speed, determined by the distance of your cursor away from your paddle. And the idea is, of course, to get the small puck into the goal on the opposite side of the field. Since you're able to move the cursor as soon as your opponent has played his or her turn, the gameplay can become surprisingly hectic at best. As you might have guessed from that description, it's a tricky game to get started on, and difficult to master. But as with many games of a similar theme, it's best played against a human opponent. Once again, a link for Xeno's comparison in the description. So many of the biggest classics in the ZX Spectrum game library were released in 1985, as was my next choice for today's 5, The Way of the Exploding Fist, from Melbourne House. Again, this is a game that both Spectrum and C64 camps claim superiority over the other, but in reality it's nostalgia that rules over analysis. The first Exploding Fist was the first head-to-head martial arts fighting game that had fight animations modeled after the demonstrations of a real-life martial arts expert, and it truly shows, in both good and bad. Obviously, being the first one of its kind makes it look exactly that today, but back then this was as phenomenal as Virtua Fighter and Tekken were when they came out in the late 90s. Personally, the Spectrum version is the one for me, mostly because that's what I played first. But if I ever bother to get back into writing comparisons, this game is one I know I should write about because it's definitely one that deserves a closer look on all platforms it was ever made for. Amstrad, BBC Micro, Commodore Plus 4 and what have you. But let's see. The last item for today is another classic from Ultimate Play the Game called Atic Atac. This is a top-down flip-screen action-adventure kind of a game, which to this day has remained a bit of a mystery to me because it's another one of those games that require mapping or memorizing, which I just never bothered to do. However, the mystique and the sheer outlandishness of the game's style has always appealed to me on a deeper level, which brings me back to it every once in a while. As with most games on today's list of 5, Atic Atac was a game that I had copied onto one of those 90-minute tapes from a tape deck to another, so it might not always load up. Aside from that, I didn't have the original leaflet to read the instructions from, but even if I had, I might not have understood them at that age, not having much of skills in the English language at the time. Now that I do have the game as an original, I still haven't read the instructions. Apparently, you're some sort of a knight, presumably the same knight that starred in Underworld, wandering around some sort of a castle, picking up items and fighting against constantly spawning enemies. I would hazard a guess that the idea is to find some sort of an item from the depths of the castle that has been locked behind a dozen doors that you need to find keys for. But I'm just happy wandering around the castle figuring out what I'm supposed to be doing. And that's part of the nostalgia, I guess.